Being Brave, written and read by Malcolm Cowper. What? You want to cancel the wedding? Don't be ridiculous. It's only 5 weeks away. It's out of the question, stormed my father. My mother was not slow to add her fuel to the flames. You must be out of your mind, Marion. The church is booked, the reception's booked, the car's booked, the honeymoon is booked. Everyone will have brought new outfits by now. It's far too late to change it. How could I begin to explain to them how I felt? It was 1961. I was 25 and still single. That was unusual in those days. Joyce, my oldest sister, was married at 21. Thelma, the next one down, was barely 20 when she tied the knot. So why was I still not married? It wasn't that I wanted a career. Most women didn't then, although that was starting to change. I had a good job in Hodges, the solicitor's office. It was undemanding, typing, filing, making the tea, but I enjoyed it well enough. Nor was I a lesbian, a word that was rarely heard in those days. Not that they didn't exist, they were just not talked about. Their sexual orientation had to be kept a secret, though at least they didn't run the risk of prosecution, unlike their male counterparts. No, I was straight, as they say these days. No, the fact was I just hadn't met Mr. Right. I don't know why. I was, without wishing to sound conceited, good-looking. I was a natural blonde, and apart from my slightly large nose, my features were regular. I had a good figure, which I kept in trim by going dancing twice a week. I wasn't shy. I could hold my own in company, and regularly went on dates. The trouble was, these dates were usually one-night stands. And I don't mean sexually. In those pre-pill days, you didn't leap into bed at the end of your first night out, as they seem to do these days. Not that I was a virgin. I had had sexual intercourse, more out of curiosity to see if it was all it was cracked up to be. And I have to say, the earth hadn't moved. Unlike the bed springs, which gave a musical accompaniment to our rhythmic bouncing. So, consequently, most of my relationships had been brief, lasting only as long as it took for my beau to realize I was not going to satisfy his carnal lusts. The key to my ongoing singleness was something I had heard at one of the many weddings I attended as one after another of my friends got hitched. The best man, in his speech, said something that deeply resonated with me. What you should ask yourself at this time, he said, is not, can I live with this person, but can I bear to live without them? That, I thought, is surely what marriage is all about. That person is so fundamentally important to your well-being that the thought of being without them is unbearable. That was the person I was looking for, and had not yet found. Then one day, Keith walked into the office. I was transfixed. The phrase, tall, dark and handsome, could have been written for him. He was fashionably dressed in an Italian-style suit, striped shirt with button-down collar, slim tie squared off at the end, chisel-toe shoes. He smiled, displaying immaculate white teeth. Hi, I'm Keith Mallender. I've come for an appointment with Mr. Hodges, 11 o'clock. For a moment I continued to stare at him, awestruck. Then, embarrassed, I stammered, Yes, he's expecting you, Mr. Mallender. Follow me, please. And I led him down the corridor to Mr. Hodges' office, just managing to avoid bumping into him in my haste. Elaine, my colleague, hadn't failed to notice my reaction. Wow, Marion, what a dish. Your eyes were like organ stops. You'll be all right there. Embarrassed by my shameless display of admiration, I just said, Oh, he's bound to be married to a beautiful wife and have 3 perfect kids. I thought no more of it and carried on working. But later that afternoon, Mr. Hodges came up to my desk and said, Marion, Mr. Mallender wants these papers as soon as possible. Would you mind taking them to him, please? He's the owner of Mallender Motors on Highfield Road. It's only 5 minutes away. Would I mind? I couldn't get my coat on quickly enough. I practically ran all the way to the showroom. Not easy in heels. I was quite breathless when I arrived. Mr. Mallender was sitting at a desk, at the far end of the showroom. "Hello again," he said, flashing those white teeth. "Ah, you've brought the papers. Hey, you look out of breath. Why don't you sit down for a few minutes, have a coffee?" "Oh, no," I said. "I need to get back. Mr. Hodges will be expecting me." "Oh, go on. He won't miss you for a few minutes. How'd you like your coffee, black or white?" To be honest, I didn't really like coffee, but I would have drunk gripe water if it had given me a few minutes with this gorgeous man, and taken his blue eyes, his tan complexion, and his fashionably styled hair. White, please." "Wendy," he shouted to an unseen girl in the office behind him, "2 white coffees, please." An hour later I left, having agreed to go out with him for dinner the following night. I can't remember what we talked about, but he made me feel the most interesting person he'd ever met. He was 30, still single, and had his own house. Perfect. His business was thriving. He specialized in top-of-the-range cars, and his own was a Jensen Interceptor, about the most upmarket car around at the time. 2 months later, we were engaged. Not only was I on cloud 9, so were my parents. No longer had they to fear that the youngest daughter was heading for every parent's nightmare place, the shelf. They were thrilled by his charm, his looks, and his success. Neither of them thought to ask if we weren't being a little hasty, that I was about to commit myself to a lifetime with a man I hardly knew. If they had, I would have dismissed such doubts with, "We're not teenagers, we're mature adults." We had intended to get married the following year, but a cancellation at the reception venue meant we could have it in 3 months' time. I couldn't wait. However, now we were engaged and the wedding date fixed, tiny seeds of doubt began to germinate in my mind. One evening, as Keith came to collect me to go out to dinner, he looked askance at my new dress. "Anything wrong?" I asked. I'm not keen on that dress. Not the right colour or style for you." I was stung by this criticism. Surely I'm capable of choosing my own dresses. I always have done. "Yes," he responded, "but you've got to think of the impression you create by your fashion choice. It'll be very important when you're my wife." I was speechless, and I felt the colour rising. What did he mean, "when you're my wife"? Was I only going to be able to buy clothes he approved of? But I couldn't find the words to express my dismay, and merely mumbled, "I'm sorry you don't like it." Then one evening we met some of his friends for dinner. I can honestly say I'd never met such dreadful people. Assertive, ignorant, pleased with themselves, and so right-wing they almost toppled Genghis Khan off the edge. They were all in sales business and couldn't help stop boasting about their deals and their profits. They showed only a superficial interest in me, and by the end of the evening I felt I'd spent it in a pit of snakes. I now began to notice that Keith's conversation was entirely focused on himself and his plans for the future. My ambitions were of no interest to him. My future was so clearly to be a trophy wife and an asset to his business. I had moved in with him, and my parents had set aside their moral objections in their keenness to get me married off to this perfect man. However, sex was a problem from the start. I insisted on him using condoms, which he disliked intensely, as he said they diminished his pleasure. His, not mine. But I insisted on it. I didn't want to become pregnant before we were married, and he reluctantly conceded. There was still a stigma in those days to bulging brides. As the wedding day drew nearer, so my misgivings grew. I realized I had been so carried away by his charm and charisma that I had failed to notice the hollow human being that lay beneath it. Though he said repeatedly that he loved me, it was in fact not me he loved, but what I represented to him. I was just another possession, like his house, his car, his clothes. He wasn't violent or abusive, but he wanted total control over me. Like a cancer, the feeling grew within me that I could not marry this man. Yet how could I not do so when the wedding was so imminent? It took several sleepless nights before I made my decision. I was going to call off the wedding. The thought filled me with dread, but I had to find the courage to do it. The next morning, over breakfast, I waited for the right moment. But there was no right moment. It was now or never. My heart was beating so fast I could barely speak. Keith, I want to call off the wedding. I don't want to marry you. For several seconds he just stared at me. Then he almost hissed, What the fuck are you on about? I can't marry you, Keith. I don't love you. I'm sorry. But what about all the arrangements? I can't back out now. Have you gone mad? It's not too late, I said. Better to call it off now before we make the commitment. He was really angry now. But why? When I can offer you a big house, a comfortable lifestyle, a smart car, whatever clothes you want? That's just it, Keith. The one word that hasn't come from your mouth is love. What you're offering me are material things, but I want a soulmate, and you'll never be that in a million years. He got up from the table. I've got to go to work. We'll talk about this later. Your father will be furious. He stands to lose a lot of money. I didn't go to work. Instead, I called in sick and went straight round to my parents' house. I had to get this over and done with as soon as possible. The tirade of abuse that greeted my announcement was entirely predictable, but when I left them, I felt an enormous sense of relief. I would still have to face Keith that evening, but the deed was done, and there was no going back. Keith had calmed down when he came home that evening. The main focus of his objections now was the humiliation he would feel when he broke the news to his friends. Nothing about how much he loved me and couldn't bear the thought of me not being there. I knew I'd made the right decision. Fortunately, my sisters felt the same way. Joyce offered me a bed in her spare room, since going back home was out of the question, and said I could stay there till I'd sorted myself out. I moved my scant possessions out of Keith's house and stayed there until I found what was euphemistically called a studio flat, but was in fact a bedsit. Having changed my home, I now felt I needed to change my job. The work was undemanding, and I needed a new challenge. I saw an advert in the local paper for a post as secretary to an architect. I applied and got the job. His name was Arthur Johnson. He worked from home, which is a rambling Georgian house in the town centre. The front room was his studio, and the room next door his office. His wife, who had died the previous year of cancer, had been his secretary. He tried to do the paperwork himself and had got into a mess. It took me just a week to get it in order, and from then on everything ran smoothly. Mr. Johnson was easy to get along with and grateful for the order I'd brought to the business. He was about 15 years older than me, tall, balding, and lacking any dress sense. He had 3 children, Michael, aged 14, Caroline, 11, and Susan, 9. I saw little of them, only as they passed the office when they came home from school. One day Mr. Johnson said, "Marion, I wonder if I could ask a huge favour of you. I've got to go to a conference on Thursday and I won't be back till about 7. Would you mind giving the kids their tea? Nothing fancy. Beans on toast will be fine." "Of course," I replied. What else had I to do but go back to my lonely bedsit? I decided I could do better than beans on toast and cooked them an omelette and chips. The children were delighted and tucked in eagerly. They were a little reserved at first, but by the end of the meal they were chatting to me happily. They were polite, intelligent, and interesting. I found myself warming to them. They persuaded their father that Marion was a much better cook than him, and could she do the evening meal every day? This was well beyond my job description, but I was quite happy to do it. As the weeks went by, so I became more and more part of the family. I had warmed not only to the children, but also to Arthur, as I now called him. He was kind, amusing, and interesting to talk to. I found myself spending more and more evenings chatting with him over a glass of wine after the children had gone to bed. Eventually he said, "Look, Marion, rather than go back to your bedsit every evening, why don't you move into the spare room here?" Pretending to be shocked, I said, "Mr. Johnson, what will the neighbours say? Think about your reputation." "Well, of course, I could make an honest woman of you. In fact, if you'd consent to marry me, you'd make me very happy indeed." "I'd be very happy to marry you, Arthur, but what about the children?" "They'd be thrilled. They've already said we should get married." I was back on cloud 9, but this time I knew it wasn't going to dissolve like last time. This man was no hollow narcissist, but a genuine and deeply sincere human being. No sharp suits, no flash cars, no phony friends, just the man I'd been looking for all along, the man I would not be able to bear to be without. Thanks to being brave and calling off my wedding with Keith, I had exchanged a lifetime of misery for one of joy and contentment.